There's an interview I really like with Paul Heyman, where he sums up his pro wrestling philosophy with "the industry moves on without you." Hulk Hogan, Ric Flair, Steve Austin, The Rock, The Undertaker. Each were at one point considered the man in wrestling. And then, one day, they weren't. They got old, their role gradually got smaller, and eventually, they retired. They'll occasionally come back for guest spots, and their legacy lives on, but what gives professional wrestling longevity is its ability to create new stars and storylines. Otherwise, to again borrow from Heyman, what have we been building?
We build something that means nothing because if it revolves around one person being involved, we're screwed. It can't revolve around one person.
I thought about this a lot as I finished Season 2 of The Mandalorian. Disney Plus's hit series of a hardened bounty hunter and the world's most adorable baby ended its second season with the surprise reveal of a young Luke Skywalker, ass-kicking his way through a platoon of dark troopers before taking young Grogu to be trained as a Jedi. It's a moment that was clearly designed to be an awesome finale that'd leave fans riding high and excited for future adventures. So why did I walk away from the show feeling so empty? I thought at first it was because of the weird digital de-aging effects to make Mark Hamill look like Return of the Jedi era Luke. It looked alright when in static, but as soon as Luke started speaking, there's this weird uncanny effect. And I have to assume the filmmakers agreed it didn't really work, because they cut around Luke's face as much as they can. Now I want to be clear, the issue isn't just the special effects are bad. This is a scene that desperately needed a warmth and comfort to justify Mando giving away his child to, from his perspective, some weirdo in a robe. But this computer-generated waxwork felt strangely inhuman. Consequently, my reaction to season's end was less triumphant awe and more uncomfortable confusion. But the more I thought about the end, and the more my disappointment grew, I realized this was something simpler than a bad special effect. On a more fundamental level, I was disappointed that the characters I'd grown to love over 2 seasons were sidelined in the climax for a legacy character to do cool action shit. Luke means a lot to me, of course, but this show was never about Luke. What made The Mandalorian special was that it offered a fresh perspective on a familiar universe, and to see that be reduced back to the Skywalkers made the whole thing feel small. And it's a firm reminder that, despite taking place in an entire galaxy far, far away, Star Wars can't move on, and it's been that way for a long time. Back in 1977, Star Wars was just a film, and a pretty self-contained one. Yes, it created its own world and left threads to be explored in the future, but Luke's hero's journey is a complete one, taking the character from impetuous youth and testing him until he emerges as a brave and worthy hero. Star Wars could have ended right here, and I really think this movie would be just as beloved as it is now. But continue it did, and part of what makes The Empire Strikes Back such an enduring sequel is the way it expanded a seemingly complete story. The characters were fleshed out, their goals and desires enriched. The concept of the Force was brought into greater focus, and the seemingly simple divide of good and evil was complicated. It was, in intent and execution, a sequel that moved on. Return of the Jedi was not. The conclusion of the original trilogy did bring Luke's journey to completion and introduce some iconic Star Wars elements like the Emperor, Jabba the Hutt, and Darth Vader unmasked, but it was also far more content to wallow in the familiar of Star Wars, whether in plot beats, locations, or even mimicked shots. Moreover, as this trilogy faded into nostalgic memory and was enshrined in pop culture, what Star Wars is became more concretely defined, such limitations becoming an albatross as the franchise tried to grow. Case in point, the prequels. For all you could criticize George Lucas for, it's clear the man wanted to do something new with Star Wars in his prequel trilogy, most significantly by complicating the politics of the galaxy. While the original trilogy offered a simple binary of heroic rebels struggling against an evil empire, the prequels dwelled on how a fascist regime can flourish within a democratic system. The Emperor wasn't the monarch heir to the throne, he was an elected official who slowly eroded the pillars of democracy, while a complacent Jedi Order didn't notice until it was far too late. Palpatine sees his authority precisely through cloaking his political maneuvers in the seemingly mundane. Debate about the taxation of trade routes is exactly the kind of dry and inhuman dialogue that disguises the profound danger at hand. And these political insights, particularly salient in the era of George Bush and Dick Cheney, were largely rejected by the Star Wars fandom. The Phantom Menace in particular was raked over the coals for its long and boring scenes of political babble. To be clear, I do think the political aspects of Star Wars could have been a lot more engaging, but this went deeper than faulty execution. There is a keen sense in the fan reaction to the prequels that politics were, quite simply, incompatible with what Star Wars was. These were meant to be fun space adventure stories, and anything to the contrary did not belong. 10 years after Revenge of the Sith, The Force Awakens did away with any such political nuance. The struggle between the Resistance and the First Order is functionally identical to the Rebellion and the Empire, even if that doesn't make any sense. The Rebels scored a pretty conclusive victory at the end of Return of the Jedi. How are they once again the scrappy underdogs dwarfed by Imperial overlords? Because that's Star Wars, baby! Coupled with narrative beats so brazenly borrowed from Episode 4, and even aesthetic elements like a backwater desert planet, the sequel trilogy seemed content to return to the comforting nostalgia of the original Star Wars trilogy. Seemed to. Then The Last Jedi came out and inexplicably became the most controversially debated movie of the decade. Critical praise, high box office, and a generally enthusiastic audience response were all overshadowed by a ferocious online backlash. Even today, mention of Rian Johnson's foray in space adventure can launch waves of venomous anger and incredulous rage, so overwhelmingly stupid it can make you hate the very concept of moving pictures. I have long avoided talking about this movie on YouTube for such reasons, but to put my cards on the table, no, I don't think The Last Jedi is a towering masterpiece, nor a particularly radical departure for the series. But I do like it. I think it's a good movie. More pertinently, while The Last Jedi certainly mirrored prior entries, it also gestured to new territory for Star Wars. Rey wasn't the offspring of a legacy character. She was someone new, trying to navigate her place in a massive conflict. There was no Machiavellian figure pulling the strings from the dark. The villain was an angry young man, dangerous precisely because of how impulsive and volatile he is. Perhaps, Johnson's film said, the answers we're looking for can't be found in the comfort of the past. Maybe we need to look forward. And so came The Rise of Skywalker, which said, actually, Palpatine's behind it all. Rey is Palpatine's granddaughter, Palpatine created Snoke and has secretly been guiding the First Order. Hell, Palpatine was even the one who seduced and brought Kylo Ren to the dark side. Virtually every problem in the story is solved by looking to the legacy characters, best embodied in Rey triumphing over Palpatine by drawing on the heritage of the Jedi who came before her. If The Last Jedi looked towards Star Wars' future, The Rise of Skywalker lurched back into Star Wars' past. There's been a lot of speculation that Episode 9 was a deliberate mea culpa to the internet fandom that hated The Last Jedi. Maybe so, but it's also possible that's just J.J. Abrams. The man's whole filmography as a director is built on repackaging old IPs with a modern slickness. The movies look glossy and flow well, but they're fundamentally repeats of things we've seen before. Consider that Super 8, Abrams' sole non-franchise effort as director, is a pretty transparent riff on 80s Spielbergian whimsy. Looking to the past is simply how Abrams tells stories. But if Rise of Skywalker was meant as a peace offering of sorts, it didn't work. The film received the worst reviews of any live-action Star Wars movie, and was generally dismissed by both those who loved The Last Jedi and those who had soured on the whole sequel trilogy. I was one of the few people I know to actually like the movie. My defense little more than Marge Simpson's, I just think it's neat. And it was in this climate of disappointment that The Mandalorian emerged. Premiering a month before The Rise of Skywalker's theatrical release, The Mandalorian quickly became a fan favorite, a well-reviewed and well-liked piece of Star Wars which was popular and arrived without controversy. To be clear, The Mandalorian is not an especially creative or bold new take on Star Wars. It's very much the same thing with a different coat of paint, reveling in the familiar Star Wars elements fans have come to love. I mean, the main characters are straight up Boba Fett cosplay and a literal baby Yoda. But beneath these layers of fan service was a real story. Mando was more than a metaphorical Boba Fett clone. He was his own man with a specific set of beliefs and goals. And while I can acknowledge Baby Yoda as the most sickeningly marketable creation since the Minions, watching Mando become surrogate father to the little guy genuinely warmed my heart. Yes, it's unambiguously lone wolf and cub. Yes, we've seen similar variations on the formula recently with things like The Last of Us and Logan. But the bond between characters nonetheless gave The Mandalorian an emotional core that transcended being a Star Wars property. Like many, the logo may have been what first drew me to the series, but it was the characters that kept me coming back. Coupled with an episodic format that led to smaller scale stories and a focus on gunslingers rather than force wielders, The Mandalorian was able to create its own unique identity within Star Wars. But as always, the albatross of Star Wars comes to bear. As the sequel trilogy ended in disappointment and the spin-off movies had largely fizzled, The Mandalorian stood as the lone piece of popular Star Wars, and that meant it got to serve as a vessel for the brand. While Season 1 was pretty self-contained, Season 2 brought a parade of legacy characters, at times acting as backdoor pilot to any number of Star Wars spin-offs. An Ahsoka show, a show about the Rangers of the New Republic, and the Book of Boba Fett, a post-credits tease so transparently an ad, right down to including the release date that it feels like an extension of Disney Investor Day. There's nothing inherently wrong with bringing back nostalgic characters. I quite like the Ahsoka episode in fact, but the increased emphasis on bringing back legacy characters slowly displaces Mando within his own show. Din less a protagonist we watch grow and change, and more a tour guide through familiar Star Wars faces. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the arrival of Luke Skywalker, who in hacking through bad guys also hijacks the spotlight. It isn't just that Luke gets an unearned hero moment in a story he previously had nothing to do with, but the enormity of his presence casts a massive shadow over the entirety of the series. To quote critic Matt Zoller's Cites, a great character like Pedro Pascal's Din Djarin becomes fascinating not because of how he practices or compromises his beliefs, but because he briefly met the dude who faced down Vader and the Emperor. The endlessly adorable Grogu becomes worthy of our attention, not because he's a case study in nature and nurture, but because Luke deemed him important enough to rescue. 2 seasons of character development and growth, all reduced in its closing minutes to how they factor into someone else's story. After the finale, I was having a conversation with a friend on Twitter, where I said I don't think I'd be interested in watching a 3rd season without Baby Yoda. A random egg, who didn't follow either of us, responded with the following: "To each their own, but if a Star Wars show about Mandalorians searching for and finding Mandalorian clans in order to bring them together back to Mandalore and rebuild their society, led by Din, doesn't interest you, my guy, I don't know. Maybe you were just a fan of Baby Yoda, not Star Wars."
Ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
My first response was a hearty chuckle. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized the egg might be right. Maybe I'm not a real Star Wars fan anymore. I hear all this speculation about Force clones made from Grogu's blood and how he's gonna play into Luke's story and what Boba's new role is gonna be. And I just don't care. What mattered to me wasn't really the Star Wars stuff, it was the core relationship between characters. Without that, I don't know if there's much else there, at least for me. I know a lot of people really loved this moment, and I'm not here to try and take that away, nor do I think I even could. But when I reflect on Season 2, the moments that stick with me have remarkably little to do with the brand. What I'm gonna remember is the parental bond between our heroes, how Grogu's upbringing shapes who he's becoming, and the sacrifices Mando is willing to make to save his adopted son. And that's what's truly disappointing about Star Wars' inability to grow. In always returning to the familiar, Star Wars abandons something human and real for a hollow caricature.